Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to really get into the heart of adult mental health.
And we're looking at a relationship that is, well, it's far more complex than just trauma causes problems.
Exactly. We're focusing specifically on men and this hidden pathway from early life adversity to things like anxiety, depression, and anger decades down the road.
And that pathway is really the key finding here. For so long, the focus has just been on the symptoms.
Or on the traumatic event itself.
Right. But what the research we've gathered shows is this non-obvious three-step chain reaction.
A chain reaction.
Yeah. We're looking at how childhood cumulative trauma, let's call it CCT, it doesn't just directly cause psychological distress. It actually works through two other hurdles first.
Two intermediate hurdles, you said.
Yes, social and emotional ones that, frankly, make the distress exponentially worse.
Okay, so let's unpack that chain right away. We have to start at the beginning. CCT. What exactly are we talking about when we say cumulative trauma?
So CCT is all about the accumulation. It's the sheer number of types of interpersonal trauma someone experienced before they turned 18.
So it's not about how many times one thing happened, but how many different things happened.
Precisely. Think of it less as the severity of one event and more as the total weight of many varied experiences.
Like what, for example?
Well, it can include psychological abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, severe bullying from peers, witnessing, intense violence between parents. It's the whole adverse environment.
That distinction feels so important. The accumulation of types suggests a constant state of instability.
It does. And that instability creates the foundation for this whole sequential problem.
So what's the sequence?
The studies show that CCT has an indirect link to the distress symptoms. First, the trauma contributes to something called masculine discrepancy stress.
Okay.
And then that stress makes emotion dysregulation worse. And it's that final piece, the inability to process feelings, that really triggers the anxiety and depression.
So if you miss those middle steps in treatment, you're never going to fully resolve the distress.
You're just treating the final symptom, not the engine driving it.
And just to drive home how common this is for the men we're discussing, the ones seeking help, what were the numbers in the research?
The numbers are, frankly, staggering. In the sample of men seeking psychosocial services, 93% had experienced at least one form of CCT.
Wow, 93.
And 83.5% had experienced two or more types. It tells us that if you are a clinician working with a man in distress, you're almost certainly working with a trauma survivor.
And that has to change everything about the approach.
Fundamentally.
Okay, so if CCT is almost a given in this population, where does that history first start to manifest as a specific problem in adulthood?
Well, that's the first domino.
The masculine discrepancy stress, or MDS.
Right. It's a socially reinforced stress. It's this constant internal pressure a man feels when he thinks he's failing to live up to these very rigid cultural norms of masculinity.
The fear of being judged as weak or not being the typical man.
That's the core of it. Deep down, it's a fear of inadequacy.
That seems a little counterintuitive, though. You'd think if someone survived a really tough childhood, they might feel, incredibly resilient, stronger even.
You would think so.
So why does the vulnerability seem to win out and lead to this feeling of falling short?
It comes down to the messaging. The core experience of CCT neglect, abuse, bullying, it's fundamentally defined by feelings of helplessness, of shame, of having no control.
Okay.
But traditional masculine norms, the script we're all given, they aggressively push the exact opposite.
Strength, emotional control, be self-reliant, be dominant.
That's the core conflict.
Yeah.
A man comes into adulthood with a nervous system that was for years trained in helplessness, but the world tells him that to be a man, he has to be completely self-sufficient and never ever show pain.
So the survivor's actual lived experience is in direct opposition to the social rulebook for his gender.
Exactly. To admit you're struggling, to seek therapy, to cry, in that rigid framework, it's seen as confirming your failure to be man enough. That clash is MDS.
The sources had a quote that really captured this, didn't they?
They did. I'm afraid that people will judge me because I am not like the typical man. It's so simple, but it says everything.
And that's not just about what other people think. It's got to be this deep internal shame, too.
Oh, absolutely. And these norms are they're baked into our culture. So many boys are taught to confuse silence with strength.
And dominance with dignity.
Yeah. And it creates this toxic vacuum where there's just no room for vulnerability,
Yeah.
no space for a man to say, I'm hurting or I'm not sure what to do.
And we should point out this pressure isn't the same for everyone.
No, not at all.
The sources brought up the strong black man stereotype, for instance. It gives you respect for appearing strong, but condemns you the second you show any weakness.
It's an impossible double bind. It forces trauma survivors into even deeper layers of hiding their emotions. The only way to survive, then, is to suppress everything.
And that desperate attempt to conform, that's what leads us to the next link in this chain.
It accelerates the whole process toward dysregulation.
This is where the whole mechanism just feels so vicious. The social pressure, this MDS, it doesn't just cause the symptoms on its own, it feels like it's the fuel for the fire.
That's a good way to put it.
So let's look at that second link. How do we get from masculine discrepancy stress to full-blown emotion dysregulation?
So first, emotion dysregulation.
Mhm.
It's the difficulty in managing intense emotions without resorting to bad coping strategies.
It's not just about having big feelings.
No, it's about your nervous system being completely unable to moderate those feelings. And the go-to strategies become avoidance, denial, or in this case, massive emotional suppression.
Okay, so let me see if I have this right. A man is stressed because he feels inadequate, that's MDS, and his attempt to manage that specific stress by trying to be more macho or stoic.
By taking it like a man.
Right. That very attempt actually makes his underlying emotional problems from the trauma so much worse.
That is the tragic sequential pathway. It's a perfect trap. When MDS flares up, the conditioned response is to double down on the masculine script. Shake it off. I don't need help.
And he uses suppression to try and align with those impossible norms.
But in doing that, he's just pouring gasoline on the fire of his own dysregulation. It basically cements that stuck survival response that the CCT created in the first place.
So the trauma is the spark, but the social pressure of MDS is the accelerant that leads to this explosion of dysregulation.
Yes.
And what are the symptoms that come out of this whole three-part chain?
Well, you see the typical things you'd expect. Anxiety, depression, but also significant anger and cognitive disturbance.
But there was a nuance in the data, wasn't there? Something about anger.
A huge one. Anger emerged as the most strongly associated symptom in the entire model. It accounted for nearly 46.5% of the variance.
46.5%. That is massive. Why anger when the original feeling might have been shame or fear?
Because in many cultures, anger is the only socially acceptable masculine outlet for emotional pain. Sadness, fear, vulnerability. They're all seen as signs of weakness. But anger can be interpreted as strength, as assertion, as being in control, even when you're completely out of control inside.
It's a filtering process. So internal distress that might register as deep sadness in someone else gets filtered and expressed as frustration or aggression.
Because that's the only expression that doesn't violate the MDS rulebook. It's the only safe emotion.
Which explains why so many men show up in therapy for anger management when the root is actually profound repressed grief and fear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also important to note a more technical point from the study.
Okay.
MDS itself was tied strongly to the emotional symptoms, the anxiety, depression, anger. But it was not a direct predictor of cognitive issues like memory problems.
Really?
Yeah. Those cognitive symptoms were primarily linked through that final step, the emotion dysregulation, which suggests it's the sheer inability to manage the flood of emotion that scrambles the thinking process, not just the social stress itself.
Okay, this is all so clear. Let's unpack the clinical side of this. We have decades-old trauma that's literally stuck in the body.
Right.
It's amplified by a constant fear of shame, the MDS, and that leads to a severely damaged ability to process feelings.
The dysregulation.
So if that's the real pathway, what does this mean for treatment? And why can't traditional talk therapy be the main solution?
Because we have to understand that trauma isn't just a story you tell. It's a physiological state. It lives in the body.
It's a stuck nervous system response.
Exactly. So any intervention has to be multi-pronged. It has to be trauma-sensitive, gender-transformative, and emotion-focused, all at the same time.
All three pillars.
If you only focus on one, the whole thing will still collapse.
Let's start with trauma-sensitive. That's about completely reframing the conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Given that almost every man in the study had CCT, we have to shift the entire clinical question. We move from a model of pathology, what's wrong with you, to a model of injury, what happened to you.
And that reframing, that right there, attacks the shame that MDS feeds on.
It does. It reframes the anger or anxiety not as a character flaw, but as a totally rational, even if maladaptive response to what they went through. That alone can make it possible for men to stay in therapy.
And the gender transformative piece. How does a therapist actually deconstruct the boys don't cry message in a practical way?
The therapy has to explicitly challenge those rigid masculine norms. The practitioner needs to create a safe space for men to reflect on their own socialization,
To connect the dots.
to connect those early messages about masculinity to why they feel so inadequate now, or why they need to be in control, or why anger is their go-to defense. It's about recognizing that MDS is an external injury that requires internal healing.
Okay, and finally, the emotion-focused approach. You said you can't talk your way out of trauma that lives in the body. How do we access that stuck state?
Through what we call bottom-up healing. When the heart rate is high or the jaw is clenched, it's because the body's survival system is still signaling danger, no matter what your logical brain says.
So you have to start with the body to calm the brain.
You start with sensation and movement to signal safety from the bottom up.
Can you give us a couple of concrete examples from the sources? What would a listener actually experience?
Sure. Let's take something like somatic experiencing or sensorimotor psychotherapy. In a session, you might pause the story of what happened,
Stop talking about it.
and instead, you focus entirely on a subtle body sensation, like a tight knot in your neck. Instead of explaining it, you just pay attention to it. You might even invite a tiny controlled movement to allow that stuck survival energy, that impulse to fight or flee, to finally complete its cycle safely.
So you're moving the trauma through the body instead of just reliving it in your mind.
That's the goal. And then there's EMDR.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Right. This uses things like controlled eye movements or tapping side to side.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, you briefly access the traumatic memory.
How does that help?
That gentle, rhythmic stimulation helps the brain reprocess the event. It links to the memory, which was filed away as raw emotion, to a sense of safety that exists right now in the room. It helps the system finally file the memory correctly.
And what about something someone can do, right now, something free and accessible?
Breath work. It is the ultimate tool for dysregulation. Things like 4-7-8 breathing or box breathing are instant ways to signal safety to your brain.
Oh.
By deliberately slowing your heart rate, you are directly activating the rest and digest system. You're bypassing the fight or flight response and telling your body in its own language, we are safe now.
It's a nonverbal act of self-reliance that's actually healthy.
Unlike suppression, yes.
What a clarifying deep dive. So, to summarize, the path from childhood cumulative trauma to adult distress in men, it's powerfully mediated.
First, by the social pressure of masculine discrepancy stress.
The shame of not being man enough.
And second, by the resulting difficulty in regulating those emotions that get locked down.
So if we want to see real change, we have to address the trauma in their bodies and challenge the rigid gender norms that are making them suffer.
That synthesis is everything. At the end of the day, the goal is to foster real emotion regulation and challenge those old norms so that male trauma survivors understand that they are allowed to feel everything without shame.
And here is a final provocative thought for you to consider. We know that the struggle for internal validation, appreciating your own worth, independent of what others think, is the essential antidote to MDS. We also know that people inherently trust what they see, your body language, more than what they hear, your words. The disconnect between how you feel inside and how you look on the outside is the visible sign of MDS. Knowing this, what small nonverbal habit, maybe a shift in posture, a moment of intentional breath, or just dropping the tension in your jaw, could you adjust today to better align your inner emotional truth with your outer presentation, strengthening your authenticity and building deeper trust, both with yourself and with everyone around you?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, it's a really personal one. We're diving deep into that intricate, often really painful relationship between what we say and what our body is actually communicating.
And the psychological cost of that gap.
Exactly. We're going to track this conflict all the way from our daily lives right up to the huge societal and historical pressures that, can force us to hide our own truth.
We're really focusing on authenticity today, and the central term for this is congruence.
Congruence.
Yeah, it's when your words, your tone of voice, your body language, when it all lines up, you're communicating authentically. But as you know, that alignment it's often missing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've all seen it. The classic example, you ask someone how they are and they say, I'm fine.
I'm fine, right. But their jaw's tight, their arms are crossed, their tone is sharp. They won't even meet your gaze.
And that discrepancy, that gap,
Yeah.
it instantly creates doubt,
Yeah.
confusion. It just feels emotionally unsafe for the person on the receiving end.
It does. And this is where you see the sheer power of the nonverbal. I mean, the data is just so clear on this.
What does it show?
Studies show that over 50% of our communication is nonverbal. So when the words and the body are saying two different things, people will overwhelmingly trust what they see over what they hear
Every single time.
every time. So if your deepest self isn't matching what you're presenting on the surface, you're risking eroding trust in all your relationships, whether you mean to or not.
Okay, let's unpack why this misalignment happens. Let's start on a daily granular level. We've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to show up for someone, but you're just failing. Maybe you want to tell a friend they're your priority, but you keep glancing at your watch.
Or your phone, mentally running through to-do lists while they're talking.
Or you want to show your partner love and affection, but you physically pull away. Or you get irritable just because you're completely exhausted.
Right. And the sources point out that the immediate fix for these kinds of, basic communication hiccups, it lies in emotional regulation. But the key is doing it before you engage.
So regulating that internal rush, that anxiety, before we even open our mouths, what does that actually look like in practice? More than just take a deep breath.
It's about checking in with your internal state first and then being honest about it. So if you're rushed, instead of trying to power through the conversation, you just acknowledge it.
So you'd say something like,
Hey, I really want to give you my full attention, but I'm running late. Can we talk in 15 minutes? Or if you're just drained, I'm feeling so wiped out right now. I want to connect, but can we do it tomorrow when I can really be present?
you're replacing that incongruence with honesty, with regulated communication.
Exactly. And check your nonverbals, too. If you're freezing and you cross your arms, just say, excuse me, I'm freezing. So the other person doesn't read it as you being closed off.
That makes perfect sense for day-to-day stuff. But the pressure to just say, I'm fine, goes so much deeper than being distracted. And this is where we need to pivot.
Right.
We need to get into the really deep internal drivers of this incongruence.
Well, this is where we have to elevate the discussion from, simple communication fixes to the question of psychological self-worth.
Right.
The fundamental struggle that pushes us to hide our true state, it's this tension between external validation and internal validation.
So needing approval from others versus approving of your
Basically, yeah. We're all wired to seek approval, a compliment, positive feedback, a pat on the back.
And it feels great in the moment.
It does. But the source material describes external validation as a sugar rush.
A sugar rush. I like that.
It's an immediate high, a spike of satisfaction, but it is so fleeting. And it forces you into this constant cycle of needing more and more approval just to feel okay.
Yeah.
And if you rely on it too much, you lose sight of your own values.
You just become a reflection of what everyone else wants you to be, not who you actually are. So the alternative is internal validation.
Exactly. Internal validation is that deep, stable sense of self-worth that you cultivate from within. It's independent of anyone else's feedback.
It's that feeling of knowing you're enough.
Yes. Regardless of what others think or how much praise you get, that feeling is the absolute bedrock of congruence.
Well, unfortunately, the social and historical systems many people live in actively work to destroy that internal validation. They force people to relentlessly chase external approval instead.
And that brings us straight to the crushing weight of internalized oppression.
It's a heavy topic.
It's devastating because it's the process where individuals start to accept the negative, dehumanizing messages that society pushes about their race, their gender, their culture, their sexual orientation. They internalize it. They start to believe that a core part of who they are is somehow wrong or undesirable.
The examples are they're heartbreaking. We're talking about the deep psychological cost of someone trying to bleach their own skin, or a young person being pushed into conversion therapy.
Or even the subtler, more insidious things. The sources mentioned an Alaska Native woman who would tease other natives for their village accent.
Wow.
These actions are symptoms of a profound internal conflict. When you internalize oppression, you adopt the oppressor's viewpoint. You start to hate your own traits. And that creates this immense psychological pressure to conform to some impossible ideal, which it just warps your whole self-view.
So if society tells you that a core part of your identity is wrong,
Yeah.
how can you ever be congruent? You just learn to hide.
Exactly.
So if that conflict, that pressure to hide is so intense, where does the body keep the score? How does that internal conflict become a physical reality?
The body becomes the literal repository of all that stress and trauma. And this is a crucial point the sources make. Trauma is not just a memory, it's a body state.
It's a body state. What does that mean?
It means it's a survival response, fight, flight, or freeze, that got stuck. The energy of that response never had a chance to move through and complete itself when the threat happened.
And that trapped energy, it doesn't just go away.
No. The body holds on to the memory of that threat. It shows up as chronic tension or specific pain points, a tight chest, sharp, unexplained reactions. You can intellectually know that you're safe now, but your nervous system is still acting like the threat is right around the corner.
And that's why traditional talk therapy sometimes isn't enough. It only hits the cognitive part.
Precisely, which is why we need to look at what's called bottom-up healing, methods that don't start with your thoughts, but start with helping the body, helping those stuck survival responses finally complete themselves.
Okay, let's connect that idea trauma as a body state to a really specific external pressure. Let's focus on the male experience.
Right. So the research introduces this critical, specialized concept. It's called masculine discrepancy stress, or MDS.
Masculine discrepancy stress. Okay, that's a mouthful. Can you give us a metaphor for that?
Think of it like a psychological fuse box. MDS is the stress that trips the breaker when a man feels like he's failing to live up to traditional masculine norms.
So strength, stoicism, being in control.
Exactly. So when something traumatic or vulnerable happens, especially in childhood, that experience directly contradicts the ideal of being strong or in control. The man feels vulnerable, but the rule in his head says vulnerability is failure. That conflict, that's MDS.
That makes perfect sense. The vulnerability itself is experienced as a threat to his identity. And there was a study that mapped this out, right, on men seeking help.
Yes, a really compelling study on over 400 Canadian men, and these were men who are already struggling. They reported an average of 4.1 different types of cumulative childhood trauma, or CCT.
Things like abuse, neglect, severe bullying.
Yes, and the analysis showed this really clear pathway. Higher childhood trauma led to higher MDS. That increased stress led to increased emotion dysregulation, basically difficulty managing distressing emotions, which in the end resulted in high psychological distress.
So the shame, the MDS, acts like a bridge. It funnels the trauma into actual diagnosable symptoms like anxiety and depression.
That's exactly. And the most compelling finding, the specific symptom that was most strongly associated with this whole pathway, was anger.
Anger.
Anger accounted for nearly half of the variance in the final model. It suggests that when men experience that conflict between trauma-induced vulnerability and the ideal of stoicism, the tension comes out as the one emotion that society deems acceptable for men.
It's safer to be seen as angry and hostile than to admit you're scared or helpless.
That's the mechanism. And this mechanism, MDS driven by trauma, it takes on this profound historical weight when we look at the experience of Black men in the United States.
Because their identity is forged not just in daily life, but in this ecological context of historical and perpetual trauma.
Absolutely. We're talking about navigating centuries of violence, starting with slavery, continuing through aggressive policing, and including horrific things like the Tuskegee syphilis study. Those rigid masculinity norms we just talked about, control, stoicism for many, they are inherited trauma disguised as what it takes to be a man, what it takes to survive in a hostile environment.
And that need for rigid control is just reinforced by these three powerful, insidious stereotypes that the sources highlight. The first one is the strong Black man.
It's a heavy one, and it actually originated centuries ago as a marketing strategy during enslavement to promote the physical strength of young Black men for sale. Now it creates this intense internal pressure. It demands emotional suppression. It confuses dominance with real dignity. You're just never allowed to break down.
And the second is the dangerous Black man stereotype.
Right, which really surfaced when Black men started gaining political and economic power after the Civil War. That stereotype cemented Black masculinity with criminality, and it's been used to justify aggressive policing and mass incarceration ever since.
Which forces a state of constant hypervigilance.
Constant. It's what's called stereotype threat. It's the daily, exhausting calculation of how you have to move, how you have to present yourself so you don't appear threatening in public. The irony is just staggering. They are constantly being watched when, historically, they've had far more to fear from external systems than the other way around.
And finally, there's the pervasive myth of the absentee black father.
A myth that is so widely internalized, yet the research completely contradicts it. While household structures can vary, Black men show incredibly high involvement in child-rearing, even when they don't live with their children. And more importantly, the stereotype completely ignores the crucial community practice of other fathering.
Other fathering.
Yeah, where Black men serve as essential father figures, mentors, and tutors for kids all throughout their community, and that practice actually positively influences their own mental health.
It's clear that healing this deep inherited incongruence, it requires approaches that honor all of this. The historical trauma, the cultural pressures, and the physical body. So, since the trauma is stored physically, let's explore the tools we have to foster congruence, starting with the body.
Since we established that trauma is a body state, healing really has to start there. We have to engage the nervous system directly. This is where somatic and movement practices come in. Two of the key methods are somatic experiencing, or SE, and sensorimotor psychotherapy.
And how do those differ from regular talk therapy?
They don't focus on the story of the trauma. Instead, they focus on tracking and staying with the specific physical sensations.
Like the tension in your jaw.
The tension in your jaw, the flutter in your belly, the heat in your chest. The goal is to help those stuck survival responses finally move through your system. You're allowing the body to complete the defensive action it couldn't finish when the trauma happened, bringing the nervous system back to a state of regulation.
That sounds like incredibly deep work.
Yeah.
What about more? Immediate tools. Things you can use to regulate a spike of distress in the moment.
The breath. The breath is always the most accessible tool. Simple techniques like box breathing, inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4.
Right.
Or 4, 7, 8 breathing. These actively slow your heart rate and send a direct signal of safety to your nervous system. And for grounding, when you're feeling anxious or spiraling, the 5 senses technique is fantastic.
That's naming 5 things you can see.
4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste. It interrupts that flashback or that spiral and pulls you right back into the present moment.
Okay, that's regulation in the moment. Now let's look at 2 therapeutic frameworks that address the mental and narrative sides of internalized oppression and MDS.
First, internal family systems, or IFS therapy, is incredibly powerful for this. IFS helps you connect with and validate all the different parts of yourself,
Like the part that's always seeking external approval.
or the part that feels constant shame. By understanding that these parts developed for a reason in response to pressure, you can start to shift power inward. You learn to integrate them instead of fighting them, and build a sense of self-worth that's stable and whole.
And what about for directly challenging those damaging cultural narratives, like the dangerous black man stereotype?
For that, narrative therapy, or NT, is key. It helps you deconstruct those dominant, harmful stories, the ones that were manufactured in socio-political contexts, and it allowed you to build a strong, authentic counter-narrative that's aligned with your real experience.
So you get to choose the story that supports your worth, not your trauma. The ultimate goal, then, is moving from a life governed by external rules to one that's directed by your own internal truth.
The entire journey of healing. It requires recognizing that everything from minor daily stress to major generational oppression is constantly pushing us toward incongruence, the path back to authentic self-worth and real communication. It relies on learning to regulate our emotional state, connecting with our body's wisdom, and actively unlearning the toxic messages that taught us we had to hide.
And when we commit to that complex work, integrating the physical, the emotional, the sociological, we can build an identity that can truly be trusted by ourselves and by the people we care about. And as we close this deep dive, maybe consider this provocative thought based on the painful reality of internalized depression.
Right.
We are not born hating ourselves or our cultural traits or our skin color. We learn that self-hatred from corrosive societal messages.
We learned it.
And therefore, the brave, necessary work right now is taking that first step, acknowledging that because those damaging messages were learned, they can be unlearned. The goal is to move from a lifetime of chasing that external sugar rush of approval to finally finding solid, unshakable ground in your own internal worth.